From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Kyle Peterson and Kim Strassel, and just want to take a shot at one of the primaries that's posed because of redistricting in New York, posed Jerry Nadler, head of the Judiciary Committee, impeacher-in-chief of Donald Trump, versus Carolyn Maloney, longtime representative of what used to be called the Silk Stocking District in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Let's listen to a clip of Jerry Nadler, who routed Maloney in the race.
I know how overwhelming these challenges can feel. I know that when confronted with fights as massive as those that lie before us, it can feel impossible to do anything but surrender. But here is the thing. I'm a New Yorker, and we New Yorkers just don't know how to surrender. New Yorkers stand up and fight. When it comes to unpacking our Supreme Court, I'm going to stand up and fight. We're going to end the scourge of gun violence in America because we're going to stand up and fight. We're going to restore abortion access across our entire nation. And I'm going to stand up and fight to protect and expand our other fundamental rights, too.
Well, there's Jerry Nadler, and just in truth in advertising, he's now my congressman if he wins in November. I'm in his district.
Lucky you, Paul.
I'll cast a vote anyway, but here we go. But I think he gives an indication of that speech of where the House agenda is going to go if there'll be a national attempt to try to codify Roe v. Wade nationally and so on and so forth. So you get a sense of the progressive agenda there. Doesn't mean much other than they took out the longtime incumbent Carolyn Maloney. But one thing that does matter, Kim, is some of these Republican races and primaries where a couple of moderates, so-called, I mean, at least conservatives to be sure, but not ultra-mega candidates. One, Nick Langworthy, beat Carl Palladino in western New York. And in Florida's 11th district, Dan Webster, the congressman there, won in a central Florida district, the 11th district, which includes the Villages, a famous community for retirees. But he only won with 50.7% of the vote against Laura Loomer, who is more mega than Donald Trump. Trump didn't endorse her, but she did sweep the Villages and is now refusing to concede defeat. But those are two seats now Republicans should be able to hold in November.
Yeah, and it was a good piece of news out of the night because if either Palladino had won up in that Buffalo area district or if Loomer had won in that Florida 11 district, those would have been seats that very much would have been at risk of being lost to Democrats, just go back to the candidate quality question. Palladino is very controversial in the state of New York over some past remarks that he has made. Laura Loomer is very, very far to the right. When you can't even get Donald Trump's endorsement, that says something. So she is refusing to concede. So far, Palladino is also refusing to concede. This is something that I find a kind of worrisome new trend that we are seeing in the wake of 2020 is when people lose, and even when they lose decisively. That Florida district, there is no question Webster won and won by a mile. Well, won comfortably, I should say. And yet we have these candidates that instantly, in the wake of 2020, now claim election fraud, election shenanigans. That really undermines trust in the system, especially when there is no evidence of any election fraud whatsoever. So we'll see how that plays out. But in general, the Republicans are pretty happy they should keep those seats.
And in Florida, one of the marquee races of 2018 is now set, where Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida will be seeking re-election against Charlie Crist, the Democrat nominated by his party on Tuesday, comfortably winning the party's nod. And that's going to have a ton of money spent. DeSantis has I'm told, about $130 million war chest already. But people are going to be watching not only whether DeSantis wins, but how big the margin he can run up on Crist, who's lost a couple of times statewide already. So we'll see. And if he doesn't get a wide victory, I think people will begin to say, just how well could he do if he decided to run for president in 2024?
I think that's right. And the other thing that I find notable about this choice of Charlie Crist is it strikes me as a bit of a sign of weakness on the part of Florida Democrats. We were discussing a couple days ago, or maybe it was yesterday on the podcast, whether Florida is just trending toward being more of a red state, maybe pushed that direction by some of the successes that Governor DeSantis has had. And now we have Democrats who have chosen the nominee who is kind of more in the center, more of a ideological cipher, a guy who was previously a Republican and then an independent after that. And so it suggests to me that they think that's what they need to do in order to try to make this seat competitive, which is interesting on its own. And it also is a little bit of a strategic calculation, the kind of thing that Republicans seem like they have not been able to do in some of these other races where they've nominated candidates who are more ideological and less able to appeal to the center.
Going to be interesting to see if another famous Florida resident, Donald J. Trump, what he says about that particular race, if he decides to help Ron DeSantis, who could run against him if DeSantis runs up the score in the presidential race. We don't know, of course, what will happen there. Kim, just sort of to sum up here in terms of the primary season, are Republicans still favored to win the House in your view?
Yes, the House. And here's why. Because right now, Nancy Pelosi has a very, very slim majority, just a couple of seats, in fact, that give her the edge. And while that means that it makes it harder because Republicans got bigger numbers going into this, makes it harder for them to rack up a huge win, it does mean that the bar that they have to jump across is relatively low. So if they go into this election season with even any little bit of an advantage, then they are likely to take the House. But it's still not guaranteed. And this is why we have to pay attention and care about what we're seeing in some of these special elections and seeing in terms of messaging. That was, I think, an important test case out of this special election in New York, as it was a very good test run of both sides' different messages that you're going to see in the general in November. One side talking about inflation, the economy, et cetera, and relying that alone will get their people to the polls. The other side talking about social and cultural issues on which Republicans are playing defense, especially issues of abortion. So the GOP ought to be looking very hard at what happened yesterday and factoring that in to how it goes forward.
All right. Before we go, I want to talk briefly, at least a little bit about President Biden's decision to forgive student loans up to $10,000 across the board, $20,000 if you received Pell Grants from the federal government, and extending for 4 more months the moratorium on student loan repayments. The moratorium began in March 2020 and now stretching well into its 3rd year. Then this moratorium will take it past the election. We don't know all the details of what they're proposing yet. The president tweeted out his decision, so we're going to get those details later today. But what we do know is that this basically is going to cost at least something like $300 billion immediately, and probably much more across 10 years once we total up all of the forgiveness. So that dwarfs immediately whatever savings in the deficit, this $100 billion or so on the Inflation Reduction Act, highly touted as an anti-inflation measure by the Democrats. And I don't think he has the authority to do this, Kyle, if you look at without an act of Congress. Yet he's going to put his signature on an executive order that just wipes out $300 and some billion worth of debt. Boom. I mean, it's good to be the king.
I think that's true. There was a review by the Trump Education Department that concluded that the president does not have this authority. You can find quotes from Nancy Pelosi at press conferences a year or two ago saying that the president does not have this authority. The question, it seems to me, on the legal issue is whether there's anybody who would have standing to challenge this in court and bring the argument that you would need in order to have this struck down. On the broader policy point, I think the White House is underrating the political salience of this. I think it will strike a lot of people as really unfair. People who have just finished paying off their loans, they will think, boy, what a chump I was. I should have waited and I could have gotten $10,000 forgiven. People who chose to go to less prestigious schools because they wanted a final student loan bill that was affordable. People who didn't go to college at all and have built a successful business, a trucking business, a plumbing business, whatever, and are going to be paying taxes to forgive the student loans of people who did go to college, who did go to these prestigious schools.
Yeah, philosophy majors who are sitting in some kind of adjunct professorship somewhere. I mean, it's...
Or their parents' basement, just let's be clear.
The other thing that strikes me is just the incentives of this, because what does it say to the next group of college graduates that are coming along? And Again, we're still waiting on the details of how the White House intends to administer this, but is this a one-time forgiveness? And then what about the person who is taking out loans tomorrow for a graduate degree they're going to get in 2 or 4 years? They're going to be clamoring then for, how come you left me out? I don't think there's a very good way to answer that question once you start a policy like this.
There sure isn't. And I think the answer probably is that once you set this precedent, every election cycle, the Democrats will be moving ahead to forgive $10,000 each cycle or more, depending on who is president and who runs the government. All right. Thanks, Kyle. Thank you, Kim. We'll have more on the student loan forgiveness issue as we learn the details tomorrow on Potomac Watch, and more on the politics as well. Thank you all for listening, and please be sure to send us your cards and letters to pwpodcast@wsj.com. Thanks for listening.